sister. Oh, hello again. I have an important new message which I need to tell you. Did you know that Abraham tithed before the giving of the law, at Genesis chapter 14? And so, because he tithed before the law, therefore, the tithe must be commanded for all time. So you need to pay a tithe today, sister.
Abraham, or Abram as he was called then, was circumcised, as also were the men of his house, before the giving of the law, at Genesis chapter 17, verses 13 and 14. Abraham also offered a burnt offering before the giving of the law, at Genesis chapter 22, verse 13. So by your own flawed logic, do you circumcise men today, and also offer burnt offerings in your church? Seeing that both circumcision and burnt offerings, just like the tithe, were both practiced by Abraham before the giving of the law.
I'm just trying to obey scripture, sister. God's law must be obeyed.
Oh, so are you now saying that paying a tithe at Genesis 14 was a part of God's Levitical law?
You were asking a difficult question, sister.
Yes or no? Give me an answer. Was the tithe at Genesis 14 a part of God's law?
I guess not.
Then why should I have to obey it, if you claim that it's not a commandment? However, God incorporated the tithe into a part of the Levitical law at Leviticus chapter 27, verse 30. So, only then did God now call the tithe holy. This verse also clearly defines the tithe specifically and exclusively as food. And then it states of the tithe that it is holy unto the Lord. So you see that the tithe was adapted into the Levitical law. But the tithe before this, at Genesis 14, was not holy. In fact, it was pagan jewelry, idols of silver and gold, and other such lightweight items, which had been captured from the wicked pagan kings in battle by their overlord, Chedorlaomer, as the spoils of war. God highlights the Sodomites as a wicked people in Genesis chapter 19. So why would their pagan possessions, captured as spoils of war in battle, be anything other than pagan and evil?
God instituted the tithe. So, possibly the tithe was a part of the law. After all, yes. I was wrong the first time.
God indeed instituted the law hundreds of years later, long after Genesis chapter 14, at Numbers chapter 18, and Leviticus chapter 27. He incorporated tithing. But Genesis 14 was before the law. But if I am wrong, then Melchizedek could not have received any tithe, as Numbers chapter 18, verse 21, states that under the law, only the Levites could receive the tithe. And Melchizedek, being a Canaanite, was not even a Hebrew, yet alone of the tribe of Levi, which was established hundreds of years later in the book of Genesis. So any pre-Levite tithe was abolished at Numbers chapter 18, verse 21. Even the Levitical regulations on the division of the spoils of war at Numbers chapter 31 was completely different to the division of the spoils of war at Genesis chapter 14. So the tithe at Genesis 14 was neither holy or a part of the Levitical law.
Yes, but Abraham tithed. Don't you get it? He tithed at Genesis chapter 14, and so why shouldn't we also tithe?
How many times did Abraham tithe?
Well, often I guess.
No. Abraham only tithed once in his lifetime. Look at Genesis chapter 20, verse 16. Here Abraham received 1,000 pieces of silver, and yet he didn't tithe anything from this amount. At Genesis chapter 14, Abraham so despised the pagan spoils of war from the pagan kings that after tithing 10%, he then gave the other 90% away, according to verse 23. So he took absolutely nothing for himself.
But Abraham did pay a tithe at Genesis 14. Don't you get it? He paid a tithe.
Let me ask you this. Who paid a tithe at Genesis 14?
Well, everyone did.
Everyone. Show me that in Genesis chapter 14. Show me where the young men who accompanied Abraham paid a tithe. Also, to whom did Melchizedek tithe to? And what about the other kings, Anna, Eshcol, and Mamre, who fought alongside Abraham? They received their share of the spoils of war, according to Genesis, chapter 14, verse 24. So, to whom did they pay a tithe to?
Well, I don't know. But I guess that they did.
You guess. Look, show me in the text where Melchizedek, together with the young men, and the kings, Anna, Eshcol, and Mamre, all paid a tithe. They didn't pay a tithe. You're simply reading that into the text, you nasty, greedy, thief.
I am not a thief. I receive a tithe from my church, which is my right. I am entitled to my big salary and my many perks, such as a large house, my BMW 5 Series, a very generous pension, and a private education for my kids. If other people in my church are poor, then that's their own sin, as God only blesses those who tithe. So I am right with God, because I pay a tithe.
I pity you, you con man. If you were a true pastor, then you wouldn't be devouring your own sheep. Look, Genesis chapter 14 is very simple. At verses 1 to 3, we read of vassal kings who rebelled against Chedorlaomer, their king. They rebelled simply by not paying him their annual tribute. This resulted in a war. Chedorlaomer was transporting lighter items, together with people, approximately 1,000 miles back to his kingdom. When Abraham and his allies met and then defeated him, Abraham was a nomadic herdsman. This meant that he, his people, and his flocks, on occasions, wandered onto other, more powerful kings' territory. This is what happened here. Melchizedek, as the local, tribal overlord, offered Abraham sustenance of bread and wine. Despite being a Canaanite king, he probably retained some distant knowledge of God through his ancestor, Noah. So he was a pagan king, but with some imperfect knowledge of God. In response to his hospitality, Abraham then tithed to Melchizedek.
Melchizedek is Jesus Christ.
No, he's not. Christ is prophet, priest, and king, whilst Melchizedek is only priest and king, but not a prophet. Also, Melchizedek is said to be like Jesus Christ at Hebrews chapter 7, verse 3. So as it's not possible to be like yourself, because you are yourself. Therefore, Melchizedek is a type of Christ, but he cannot be Jesus Christ himself.
But Melchizedek worshipped the Most High God, according to Hebrews 7, 1. So Melchizedek and Abraham worshipped the same God, who was called Yahweh.
Well, I'll admit that the Hebrew phrase, El Elin, which is translated as Most High God, is indeed a most difficult phrase, and that many scholars have disagreed upon its exact meaning, at both Genesis 14, and also at Hebrews 7. There are three main explanations of El Elin. Firstly, your position, that it refers to Yahweh. Secondly, the diametrically opposite view, which is that this name belonged to the chief Canaanite deity of their pagan pantheon, therefore it refers to a pagan deity. Thirdly, my own position, which is that this expression, Most High God, simply means the Supreme God, as it's used by both pagans and Jews, and also demons in the Old and New Testaments. To make matters even more complicated, Most High God might possess a range of meanings in Scripture, so that just like the word gay in English, the meaning has changed over time.
But Most High God is used at Hebrews 7, 1, which means that Christians used this term. So Most High God means Yahweh?
Actually no. Christians never referred to either Christ or to Yahweh as the Most High God. But the demons used this phrase in the New Testament, as also did the demonized girl, at Acts chapter 16, verse 17. You see, a demon isn't going to use God's covenant name, or refer to God as Father, seeing that demons aren't in a covenant relationship with God. So, Most High God is simply a way of saying, the Supreme God. It's essentially common ground, which God's people, as well as pagans and even demons, can use to communicate. It's also significant that when speaking with a pagan king in the book of Daniel, that both Daniel and also the pagan king both used this term so that they could then understand each other.
But why do we read Most High God at Hebrews 7:1?
Well, although it's not a salvation issue, the phrase Most High God at Hebrews 7, verse 1 proves that Melchizedek, whilst possessing some faith in God, was nonetheless a Canaanite king, living amongst his fellow Canaanites, whose knowledge of God was imperfect. If Melchizedek's faith in God was as perfect as Abraham's, then Hebrews 7, verse 1 would read like this: For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Lord. So, by reading Most High God, the author of Hebrews is giving us a clue that Melchizedek's faith, although sincere, was not perfect, as God's covenantal name is omitted. But let me ask you a question. Read Exodus chapter 6, verse 3, and then tell me if Abraham knew God's name.
No, he didn't. Exodus 6:3 states that absolutely nobody knew God's name, Yahweh, until during the Exodus from Egypt.
I agree. But you have a direct contradiction between Genesis 14, verse 22, which states that Abraham knew God's name, Yahweh, and Exodus 6, verse 3, which states that nobody before the Exodus knew this name.
Well, what's the answer then?
The most logical explanation is that Melchizedek was a pagan Canaanite king, who by saying Most High God actually meant the supreme God. He might have known of Abraham's God, but only imperfectly. The redactor of the book of Genesis, who I'd take to be Moses, deliberately inserted the word Yahweh into the text of Genesis 14, verse 22, in order to tell us that whilst Abraham had a covenant relationship with God, so that his God was Yahweh, Melchizedek, although sincere, was still a Canaanite, with an imperfect knowledge of God, which had been retained from Noah, and which is why Melchizedek is corrected here.